All right, well, it is 12 p.m. here in Wisconsin at our office in Fort Atkinson, so I will officially begin this webinar. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Hoard's Dairyman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is titled Vitamins for Dairy Cattle. When fed correctly, vitamins improve cow health and productivity. Historically, only vitamins A, D, and E were supplemented in dairy cattle rations, but with increasing milk production, certain water-soluble vitamins often have a place in dairy cow diets as well. This webinar will discuss current recommendations for vitamins and potential responses when they are properly supplemented. Our presenter is Dr. Bill Weiss, who is a professor emeritus at the Ohio State University. If you are listening to the presentation live, you can click on a copy of the slides. It's down in the handout section of the control panel. That is just available for you in case you want to save it to your computer and print it out and have it for future reference. I also encourage you to type any questions you might have as you're listening to the presentation in that questions section of the control panel, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. Now, it is my honor to introduce to you today's presenter. Bill Weiss is a professor emeritus at the Ohio State University. Prior to retiring, he conducted research and extension activities in dairy cattle nutrition. One area his lab researched was the effects of various vitamins on cow health and production. This research contributed to the development of feeding recommendations for several vitamins. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Weiss with us again. He has been a speaker for us in the past. He has written some articles for the print edition of our magazine and has just really been a good friend to Hoard's Dairyman. And we are really excited to have him as part of our webinar today and listen to the information he shares in this presentation, which is titled Vitamins for Dairy Cattle.
Thank you, Abby. It's a pleasure to be back. I've always enjoyed participating in this. Today's webinar is going to be on a pretty specific topic, but it's a topic that hasn't been addressed before, and there's been a fair number of new developments in this area. But just to start off with, if you're a nutritionist and you're formulating diets, vitamins are not that difficult compared to everything else you have to do to get a good diet. But even if they're not difficult, there's some thinking involved on how much, what type. So in diet formulation, I'm not going to go into this, but by far the most difficult thing is energy, carbohydrates, and amino acids and proteins. That's the first thing a nutritionist works on. Then he moves to minerals. This is much less complicated than energy and protein, but there's still some difficulty in here. You have to consider a source, antagonist, etc. Then comes vitamins. And the main decision you have to make as a nutritionist is how much. You should be buying vitamins from a reputable supplier, so you don't have to worry a whole lot about a source, but how much, and are there adjustments to certain recipes? And that's what we're going to cover today. And then lastly, our feed additives. And you'll see a connection here between vitamins and additives, because some of these vitamins we use at the rates we're feeding, they're probably not acting as a vitamin. They're acting as what we would call supra-nutritional effects. And so it's really acting more as an additive than as a vitamin. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It's just, it's clearly in excess of what they need to meet their basic requirements. We'll talk about that as well. So just to summarize the beginning here is, vitamins are great and wonderful. They're essential, but too much can cause problems. Some vitamins on a mass basis are extremely toxic. Vitamins don't weigh very much. So if you feed the right amount, we expect better cow health. There's been quite a bit of research showing supplemental vitamins improve, reduce retained placenta, reduce metritis, etc., reduce mastitis. It improves reproduction. The data is less clear on this simply because repro studies take so many cows, but the data that's out there shows positive effects. It can increase milk yield. Some of that effect on milk is because of health, but some of it isn't. Some of it is metabolic. Improves the nutritional value of milk and dairy products. Unfortunately, we're not paid for having high vitamin E milk or high folic acid milk, but eventually you might get it, and it does help sell dairy products if we can say our milk is an excellent source of vitamin X, Y, and Z. And then when you finish it up, the proper amount of vitamins is a very profitable addition to diets. On the other hand, too much is detrimental to health. It's not neutral, it's detrimental. It can reduce milk yields. Some of this is because of these detrimental effects on health, but some of this is metabolic. Again, too much can reduce milk yields. Vitamins aren't free, so if you overfeed vitamins, you're inflating feed costs, and the sum of all this is it reduces profitability. So your job as a nutritionist is get here without getting here. Okay, I'm not going to make this a biochemistry lecture. I put this slide in. This is the only one on function that I'm going to have in here. But the reason I put this in is just to emphasize how diverse the functions of vitamins are. They're involved as enzyme cofactors in metabolism, almost every nutrient. Amino acid metabolism requires vitamins. Fatty acid metabolism requires vitamins. Carbohydrate requires vitamins. So just about anything a cow does is going to need a vitamin. It regulates genes, and especially this is more for the fat soluble, but some of the water soluble vitamins also are involved in gene regulation. And if you're regulating expression of genes, that can have a whole host of effects. And this is a reason why deficiency of vitamin A has certain effects on immune function, but too much vitamin A have some of the opposite effects. And a lot of that is via gene effects on gene and eventual protein expression. Some vitamins are antioxidants. We think mainly vitamin E, but there's some other ones. And then mineral metabolism. And again, a lot of people think vitamin D, calcium, and phosphorus, but there's also other involvements. So just keep in mind that the responses to vitamin supplementation or vitamin deficiencies are wide-ranging. You can see just about any effect if you're vitamin deficient, or almost any effect if you're excess. Okay. When we look at a cow, vitamin needs or vitamin definitions depend on species. The vitamins needed by a human aren't necessarily all needed by a cow. Right now, we think a cow needs to absorb, and absorb is a key word here, 12 vitamins. And I'll get to the why some are 13. There are 4 fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. K is largely ignored, and for good reason. One is there hasn't been any research probably for 30 years on this. Rumen bacteria make vitamin K, intestinal bacteria make vitamin K, and with the one exception of feeding moldy sweet clover hay, vitamin K is a non-issue for dairy cows. If you feed moldy sweet clover, it has a compound that can affect blood clotting, and you need supplemental K, but that's the only situation, and that's extremely rare, especially in dairy. So K won't be discussed. The water-soluble vitamins include biotin, B12, folic acid, niacin, pantothenic acid, pyridoxine, riboflavin, and thiamine. Cows, we don't supplement most of these for good reason. I'll get into a little more detail later on some of these. And some of these, there's virtually no research at all in cattle because we don't think there's going to be any response to supplementing. Other ones have responses. But for some of these may be, the responses may be more feed additive like than vitamin like. But I will discuss some of these water solubles. And that brings us to the 13th vitamin, and that's choline. And the reason it's not outright called a vitamin is because it doesn't fit the definition, the classical definition of vitamin. Choline doesn't fit. Cows, if you do not feed rumen protected choline, cows absorb essentially zero choline from the gut. Bacteria don't make it, and what's in the basal diet is all destroyed. So they don't have to absorb it. And it's also needed in fairly large amounts. So cows synthesize it, which violates the definition, the classical definition of a vitamin, and you need it in large amounts, relatively large amount, which also is not the definition of a vitamin. But it's often considered a vitamin, I think, because we don't know where else to put it. So I am going to include some discussion on choline. Just to start out here, when I said absorb, that doesn't mean you have to supplement it. It doesn't even mean it has to be in the diet, but it has to be absorbed from the gut. The cow can't synthesize it. And again, choline is kind of an exception here. So you don't go out and start supplementing pantothenic acid. It's just these 12 to 13 compounds have to be absorbed by the gut or into the circulation.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. This is your opportunity to pull from your brain a little bit and see what you know on this topic about vitamins. So here is our first question. With typical cow management and diets of today, which vitamin or vitamins almost always needs to be supplemented for lactating dairy cows? Select one of the following answers. Vitamins A, D, E, biotin, and niacin. Vitamins A, D, and E. Vitamins A and D. Vitamin A, or none of the above. So I'll let you spend a moment and pick your answer. Looks like we have good participation. Good work, everybody out there. So a pretty close finish in the beginning. Vitamins A, D, and E was the top choice, with just over half of the people picking that answer. And then 40% of people picked vitamin A, D, E, biotin, and niacin. And then just a few people chose the other answers, Dr. Weiss. So if you have any follow-up comments, we would welcome them.
I'm glad not too many people picked E, or the seminar would be over. The key word here in this question is almost always. And the almost always, probably B is most correct. That doesn't mean A isn't correct in a lot of situations. But in some situations, especially this would be grazing cattle, you probably get by with just vitamin A supplementation. But in the US, we're mostly confinement, limited sun exposure to cows. So A, D, and E is almost always needed, but very often other ones are recommended. I want to first start with a definition. This is new with the new NASM, which used to be called NRC. If you've read that book or you heard talks on it, when they come to vitamins, they don't use the word requirement. They use the term adequate intake. They say the adequate intake of vitamin A is X. And that terminology was chosen just to reflect that we don't, because of very limited data with vitamins, the accuracy of how much a cow exactly needs isn't known. The amount of vitamin needed exactly by a cow is not known with high precision. And so again, with requirements, we think they are more accurate, more precise. And when the committee sat down and came up with these adequate intakes, what they did was they picked the minimum value shown to have an effect. And to get this a little clearer, because this is a confusing concept for a lot of people, I just put together a little example here. And let's say there was an experiment looking at supplemental vitamin E control with no supplemental E versus 1,000 units. The 1,000 unit reduced mastitis. So the committee would look at this and say the adequate intake of vitamin E is 1,000. That doesn't mean 2,000 might be better or 500 might have been enough. We don't know, but 1,000 was shown to be beneficial. If then someone conducted a second experiment comparing 0 to 5,000 units, and they showed the 5,000 reduced mastitis, the adequate intake would still be set at 1,000, because this doesn't prove 5,000 is any better than 1,000. It just said it worked. So this would be the reason we'd stick at 1,000. But let's say a third experiment was conducted where they fed 0, 1,000, or 2,000, and they showed 2,000 was better than 1,000. In that case, 2,000 would be selected as the adequate intake. And again, that doesn't mean 4,000 might be better, or maybe 1,500 is fine. We just don't know. And so that's the reason we use this adequate intake term, because there's just uncertainty around the exact amount needed. But the adequate intake has been shown to be beneficial. And for most formulation, I just consider the adequate intake like a requirement. Okay, we're going to run through some vitamins, not all of them, but some of them. Vitamin A, the benefits that have been shown in cattle, and I'm going to limit, with a few exceptions, I'm limiting the data to cattle responses. With adequate vitamin A, we reduce retained placenta, which likely reduces metritis. We reduce abortions, we reduce mastitis, and we can increase milk production. Some of this milk is because of health, but some of it is metabolic. On the other hand, feeding too much vitamin A can reduce vitamin E absorption, which means if you feed a lot of vitamin A extra, you probably have to start feeding more vitamin E. It can reduce milk, and again, this is metabolic. This is a cellular effect. And then maybe just general toxicity. So in the most recent NRC, or the most recent NASEM, the requirements for vitamin A, D, and E, it's supplemental. We don't give the basal feed any credit. And the reason for that is, one is labs can't measure it, or it's very difficult and expensive to measure. Some labs will measure it, but it's going to be expensive, so it's not worth it. The variation in basal vitamin levels is very high. So the committee just said, let's assume it's a typical diet, and we'll make the adequate intake supplemental. And the adequate intake for lactating cows and dry cows is 50 units per pound of body weight. And that's for a lactating cow and a dry cow, it's going to be up around 75, 80,000 units. Now, they added this term, and cows that are producing more than 75 pounds of milk, they've added this term here. So for every pound above 75, you add in 454 units. This is because a pound of milk contains about 450 international units of vitamin A. So this is covering vitamin A that's secreted into milk. The reason we started at 75 pounds is because there's most of the data that went into this number here had cows up to 75 pounds. So that the vitamin E and vitamin A in that milk's already been considered. So just for higher producing cows, we're accounting for retinol in milk. Prefresh for vitamin A is the same as dry cows. I'll get into this a little bit later, but the bottom line is simply no data showing feeding increased amounts of vitamin A in the prefresh period did any good. Now, these are the NASEM adequate intakes, but I'm saying right down here, you should almost always feed above that. And I probably should not even say almost always. You should feed above this level, and I'll cover that as well. Okay, here's some things you need to consider when you're sitting down and saying how much vitamin A, let me back up here, how much greater than this number should I feed? Vitamin A is the most labile vitamin we feed. It breaks down, it's not real stable, and it can break down. If vitamin A is stored in a premix, stored in cool conditions, away from sunlight, not kept dry, you lose about 3% a month, just sitting on the shelf. So hopefully the turnover is enough that this isn't a big deal. If you put that vitamin A in a trace mineral premix, vitamin trace mineral premix, now you're losing up to about 9% a month if the premix contains inorganic trace minerals. This is mainly copper and zinc. So if you have copper sulfate in the mix, zinc sulfate, you're going to greatly enhance degradation of vitamin A. So again, if it's sitting around either the farm or the warehouse with this, you're going to have to build in some extra supplementation rates. E is quite stable. D is moderate, but not a lot. So vitamin A is the one we really have to think about. If it's not stored correctly or stored too long, you're going to have to increase supplementation rates. Okay. Vitamin A also, of the fat-soluble vitamins, it's most likely to be destroying the rumen. This is a summary of 2 studies using in vitro rumen fluid. High forage, moderate forage. So this would be, moderate to high starch. This would be low starch. With high forage diets, you lose about 20% of the vitamin A. This is loss of commercial supplemental vitamin A, so not a big deal. But when you start feeding higher starch diets, then you can lose 60–70% of it is broken down the rumen. Now, this doesn't mean if you're, a typical lactation diet might be 50% forage. That doesn't mean you need to go in all of a sudden and increase supplementation rates 70% to cover this loss. This has already been built into the requirements, into that adequate intake. It assumes a diet with about 25% starch. So some of this degradation is already built in. Not all of it, which I'll get to, but some of it is. So you do not have to greatly increase supplementation rates, even though vitamin A is destroying the rumen. And the last thing you need to consider is the basal diet. Plants do not have vitamin A. They don't make vitamin A, but plants make beta carotene. And then there's an enzyme in the intestine of a cow or intestine of most mammals that convert beta carotene into retinol or vitamin A. And so you'll see here, so these are what's called vitamin A equivalents, but it's based on the beta carotene concentration. You see, fresh pasture has a ton of beta carotene, which means it has potentially a ton of vitamin A. On the other hand, straw has essentially no beta carotene and essentially no retinol equivalent. Alfalfa silage, grass silage, corn silage are in the middle. Hay has less than silage. There is a lot of variation on these. These are averages, but like most vitamins in feeds, a lot of variability. So we don't, most of the studies have been done with these ingredients: hay silage, corn silage, and hay. So this is kind of where we start, and then you might need to adjust, or you should adjust upward if you're feeding straw, and you should adjust downward if these cows are grazing. I want to just comment briefly on this. This is the assumed conversion of beta carotene. This number is probably 50 years old, or maybe even older. Data with humans says the old conversion for humans was wrong. The humans for the human, what's equivalent to the NRC for cows, the human requirements cut the conversion efficiency in half for beta carotene. They said humans are much less able to convert beta carotene to retinol than previously thought. We don't know if that's true for cows, but I just want to emphasize this is a very old number. So for vitamin A, you start with NASEM, and then you make some adjustments. Again, if 25% starch or less, you don't have to adjust for dietary starch. But based on in vitro data, for every unit of diet starch above 25, you should increase vitamin A about 2,000 units. So if you had 30% starch in your diet, I'd feed about 10,000 units more vitamin A. For beta carotene, if pasture is, if 30–40% of the diet is pasture, you probably are meeting the requirement or the adequate intake for vitamin A. But again, because of this uncertainty on the conversion efficiency, I would still supplement some. I would reduce. You don't need to feed as much as NASEM says, but I would still feed some supplemental vitamin A on pasture. In a prefresh or dry cow diet, you're going to feed straw. And let's say you have an inclusion rate of about 8 pounds, you're going to take out usually hay or some silage. So you're reducing basal beta carotene. And if you do the math, that means you should, to make up for that lost beta carotene, you have to feed about 15,000 units more. And then lastly, there's this risk. There's a lot of uncertainty, and feeding 20% or so extra for vitamin A, you might want to go higher, maybe up to 30% extra just to cover risk is probably a good idea. So as an example here, I'm going to, for a dry and pre-fresh, the base would be 77,000. Let's say you have straw in the diet. I'm going to bump that up to 92,000. We're not feeding that much starch. For this risk, I'm going to bump it up to about 110,000 units a day. So NASEM says 77,000, but I'd probably be feeding around 110,000. For lactating cow, Holstein, NASEM would say 72,000. Let's say I'm feeding a high starch diet, I'd feed 82,000. Let's say it's a cow producing 100 pounds of milk, it would be 82,000. These are additive. So if it's a high producing cow with a high starch diet, it goes up to 92,000. Build in the safety factor, so you're up again around 110,000. So dietary vitamin A supplementation rates, 100, 110,000 will work in most situations, probably almost all situations. Now, how about too much? Too much vitamin A is related to osteoporosis, fetal deformities, and it suppresses immune function. Vitamin A deficiency suppresses immune function. So you get the same, the mode of action is different, but you get the same result with a vitamin A deficiency and a vitamin A excess. Now, if we stick to cow data, if cows were fed 500,000 units a day during the dry period, the subsequent milk yield was significantly lower, but that's six and a half times requirement, or 6.5 times the adequate intake. At around 800,000 units a day, which was 12 times adequate intake, cows developed osteoporosis. And at 600,000 or 700,000 units, vitamin E status was reduced. So these are very high, but there's no data to say what happens at 2 or 3 times the adequate intake. We just don't know. But you clearly want to avoid these real excessive amounts. And here's just something to think about. In humans, if you read the scientific papers, for a long time, 10 times RDA caused signs of osteoporosis. So the excess of vitamin A was saying keep less than 10 times the RDA, which is a pretty wide safety margin. But much more recently, where we have better measures of osteoporosis at the cellular level or even at the gene level, now what they're saying is they can start observing abnormalities that could lead to osteoporosis when vitamin A is fed at just 2 times RDA, which isn't much of a safety factor. So again, with cows, we don't know, and so you need to weigh the risk versus reward of these high levels of supplementation. The reward above about 110,000, I'm going to say, is very likely to be 0. I don't know what the risk is, but it might be there. So just be cognizant of these effects of excess vitamin A. Vitamin D, as you're all probably familiar, is made by the sun exposure. The cow exposed to sun makes vitamin D3, gets absorbed into the blood. Or you feed vitamin D3, it gets into the intestine, is absorbed into the blood. The liver then converts the vitamin D to 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which circulates in the blood, and this is often used as a status indicator. And then in a tightly regulated conversion, 25-hydroxy is converted to 125-dihydroxy vitamin D, and this is the active form. It's actually considered a hormone. This happens in the kidney. You usually supplement D3, but you can now purchase 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Okay, for vitamin D, I'll go on the same thing. In the NASEM requirement, or NASEM adequate intake, I've got to get used to saying that as well. What they determined is they said, well, how much vitamin D needs to be fed to maintain blood levels of 25-hydroxy above 30 nanograms. With dry cows, it was said somewhere around 25,000 units a day will maintain blood levels, and that includes this 20% safety factor, will maintain blood levels above 30. For lactating cows, this is higher than the previous number, and so you're going to be up around 30,000 units. And this should maintain blood levels of most cows above 30 nanograms. This is assuming vitamin D3 is fed. Not many people feed D2, but the data suggests that D2 is only half as good as D3. So if you're feeding D2, you need to double these. And this is based on limited sun exposure. So this would be for confinement cattle, lactating cows, around 30,000 units. Okay. Sun exposure. I'm showing this slide. This is one of the neatest experiments I read. This was done in Denmark, and they looked at how much vitamin D can a cow make if it's exposed to sun. And they had 4 levels of sun exposure. This picture shows 2. They had one set of cows that had nothing, no skin covering at all. Then they had a set of cows where all they covered was the udder, thinking the udder doesn't have much hair, it will be much more sensitive to sun exposure. They had another set of cows where they covered almost everything except the udder. Of course, the head is exposed and some legs. And then the 4th group was they covered everything here plus the udder. And they measured plasma 25. They started cows at a very deficient state. They didn't feed vitamin D, and they kept them in the dark. So these cows are clinically deficient in vitamin D. They turned them out in pasture, and those cows that had no cover within 3 weeks were adequate, and no supplemental dietary levels. The ones with mostly, except for with only the udder covered, it took a little longer. With everything except the udder, it's a lot lower, and with everything covered, they never recovered. These were always deficient animals. So what this is saying is cows outside in direct sunlight in the summer, you need 5 to 6 hours, and these cows can make enough vitamin D to meet their needs. It has to be direct. In fall, winter, and spring, the sunlight usually is not direct enough to get good synthesis rates, and it has to be long enough. This is a study of confinement cattle in the US, survey types things. And they went 12 herds. Most of these herds fed about 30,000 units a day. The way to read this graph is the line here is the median number, the median blood number for that herd. The box means 50% of the cows are within this box. The lines, which are called whiskers, 90% of the cows are within these lines. And then the dots are cows that were in the lowest 5% or the highest 5%. So they're outliers. And you can see at 30,000 units, almost every cow met the limit of getting blood levels at 30 nanograms. Almost every cow, there's a few exceptions. So that's why we came up with this as being the adequate intake, because it's saying almost every cow, this will be enough. This herd here only fed 20,000 units. Still, most of the cows were fine, but a substantial number were below this level, and that's why NASEM increased the adequate intake for vitamin D from 20 to 30, which should be enough, again, for most cows. Now, you can buy 25-hydroxy-D, and this is this intermediate, and when you feed this, you get extraordinarily high plasma levels. It's been shown if you feed negative DCAD to improve calcium metabolism, if you feed the right dose, it has increased colostrum yield and it has increased milk in early lactation, but not consistently. And again, dose is critical. Or too much will actually be detrimental to calcium metabolism. So 1 to 3 milligrams. This just shows you this is 2 levels of vitamin D, and the lowest level is 65,000. So that's 2.5 times adequate intake. You get numbers down around the 60 unit range. If you feed the same amount of 25, you get more than double or triple the amount. So you get these huge concentrations of 25. When we look at milk production, this study, I'm showing this for 2 reasons. One is this very high level of vitamin D, which would be about 180,000 units, depressed milk production. Vitamin D, high levels of vitamin D depressed milk production, but high levels of this 25 had a slightly positive effect. But the regular vitamin D suppressed it. And then this study here, they looked at this in a little more detail, and I just want to concentrate on these. And they broke cows down into cows that had some health problems and cows that didn't. The treatment was fed during the prefresh period. After they calved, they all went on vitamin D. So there's no treatment after they calved. And what they found here is without cows that had no problems, feeding more vitamin D didn't do anything. It didn't increase milk, didn't hurt milk. The 25 hydroxy D had a slight positive effect on milk production in healthy cows. Not much, but a slight positive. But when they took the group of cows that were sick, had some disease, DAs, RP, something, laminitis, something, the high vitamin D greatly inhibited or suppressed milk production. You lost almost 10 pounds of milk with high vitamin D in sick cows. Conversely, in sick cows fed 25 hydroxy D, you got about 10 pounds more milk. It's still less than healthy cows, but you gained back a lot of what you lost. So this is a fairly new, just came out last year. So this obviously needs more research, but it's something to think about. Okay. Vitamin E, I'm going to go a little quick through here because it's not that much new, but dry cows, about 1,000 units a day. Lactating cows, about 500 units a day. And then the change was for pre-fresh cows. It went up to 2,000 units a day. And this was based on mastitis, metritis, retained placenta data.
All right, we have one more opportunity to pick an answer and participate this way in the webinar. So here's our question. Cows secrete vitamin E in their milk. Why is more supplemental vitamin E recommended for dry cows than for lactating cows? Choose one of the following answers. Dry cows consume less basal E than lactating cows. Cows transfer a lot of vitamin E to the fetus. Cows transfer a lot of vitamin E to colostrum. Both A and C, or all of the above. So if you would pick one of those answers, the biggest majority, 38%, chose all of the above. 28% of people said A and C. 20% said cows transfer a lot of vitamin E to colostrum, and then 7% picked the first 2 options, Dr. Weiss. So all of the above was the most popular answer.
Okay. The correct answer is A and C, actually. Cows, for reasons I don't understand, transfer almost no vitamin E to the fetus. When a calf is born, if you take a blood sample, you will find almost no vitamin E in the blood. Same with vitamin A, it's almost devoid, which is one more reason colostrum is so important. Because that's where these calves get their vitamin A and get their vitamin E. So they have a high requirement because they have to put a lot of vitamin E in colostrum, but also the feeds are pretty low, and for the feeds for a dry cow are pretty low, so they get much less basal vitamin E. But colostrum is critically important, and vitamin E is just one more reason. Vitamin E and mastitis, most of the studies have shown feeding supplemental vitamin E improves mammary gland health. but there's been one study where it was actually negative. And that's this study here. They went to 5 different herds. So this is a huge study. And for the entire dry period, I want to emphasize this is the entire dry period, it's not pre-fresh. They fed 3,000 units or 130,000 units. And then they measured mastitis, and there is some technical issues with the way they define mastitis, but I don't want to get into that. But you'll look on most of these herds, the cows fed the low vitamin E had less mastitis. Herd E here, it was the vitamin E, supplemental vitamin E reduced mastitis. Overall, there was a 1.7 times greater relative risk for mastitis if you fed 3,000 units a day for 60 days. So this is just one more reason. If you feed 1,000, I don't think you would saw any problem. Or if you limited this to just a 2 or 3 weeks prepartum, they probably would have seen benefits. But excess vitamin E for a long time clearly is not beneficial, and it may actually be detrimental. The reason we recommended more vitamin E pre-fresh is largely shown right here. This is a typical cow. When she gets close to calving, vitamin E in the plasma decreases markedly. This is a cow without a mammary gland. She's still at a calf, but this is a cow without a mammary gland. It still drops, not as much, because this difference here is what went into colostrum, but it still dropped. And if we feed excess vitamin E pre-fresh, we almost eliminate this drop. That's why we recommend higher levels pre-fresh. If we look at vitamin A here, without a mammary gland, it doesn't drop a bit. So this is saying this drop prepartum in retinol is almost exclusively due to transfer to colostrum, which is, again, critically important. But there's no data saying if I feed a lot of vitamin A, I can prevent this drop. So that's why the committee didn't recommend extra vitamin A pre-fresh, but did recommend extra vitamin E. Okay, what about water solubles? Feeds contain a lot of B vitamins. Rumen bacteria make B vitamins. If you supplement a lot of the B vitamins, they're destroyed. And there hasn't been, in a healthy cow, there has not been a clinical deficiency of a B vitamin ever shown, with the exception of B12, but you can fix that with cobalt. So the question, do you need these? Well, cows do make a lot of B vitamins. This is a couple of studies, a summary of a couple of studies. This is niacin. This is the basal niacin. The gray bar is synthesized, ruminally synthesized, and cows make more niacin than they consume in unsupplemented diets. Same with folic acid. B12, we don't feed B12, but if you feed cobalt, they can synthesize a lot of it. And in these studies, they found cows don't make biotin, but biotin is very, very difficult to measure. So I think this is an analytical issue. If you look over here in an in vitro system, the gray bar again is synthesized biotin. They synthesize. I mean, I think cows can synthesize biotin, but you also notice that as they increase grain, decreased forage, the amount of synthesis decreased. So biotin likely can be synthesized, but high grain diet synthesis rates are probably less. This is data showing if I supplement just standard B vitamins, these are not protected, 98% of the niacin was destroyed. A similar amount of folic acid. 60% of B12 was destroyed. Biotin, 50%. Again, these huge standard error bars for biotin is likely analytical. It's just very, very hard to measure. So for a lot of these things, if you're going to destroy most of it, it means you have to supplement huge amounts, or you have to rumen protect it. I'm just going to summarize this rather quickly on biotin, and this is most of this data is on non-rumen protected biotin. So even if you're degrading half of it, it's still having positive effects. It improves hoof health, and it's been shown to increase milk about 3 pounds. Niacin at 12 grams a day, not 6, but at 12 grams a day, there is a lot of variability, but it's been shown to increase milk about 1 pound. It might reduce measures of ketosis, and it might reduce body temperature via vasodilation. But again, it takes a lot of niacin because so much is degraded. If you're feeding a rumen protected type, the amount the responses might occur at lower doses, and that might reduce some of this study variability. For B12, basically, if you're meeting the cobalt requirement, you shouldn't expect a lot. And 0.2 parts per million cobalt or a little more, and you probably don't expect a lot of B12 response. Fresh cows might benefit from it because these cows do have low plasma B12. And then in the study with B12 plus folic acid, had to be given by injection because of rumen destruction, that increased milk. It was a pretty substantial increase, but the economics probably is not there. On choline, about the standard dose, about 12 grams active. It has to be rumen protected. Almost 100% of choline will be destroyed in the rumen if it isn't protected. And the results have been pretty positive. Increases colostrum if you start supplementing this in the pre-fresh period, and then it increases production in early lactation. And most studies only go to about 60 days, so we don't really know what happens later in lactation, but the response is pretty substantial. So in summary, in most situations, A, D, and E must be supplemented because, again, we don't have cows outside. They're not grazing fresh pasture. Bad things happen when you don't feed enough, but remember, bad things also happen when you feed too much. I'm a proponent of this 20-25% extra, not doubling or tripling like I often see, but 20-25% extra, plus some additional adjustments like for vitamin A and high starch diet. And supplemental water-soluble vitamins are not essential. Cows will not show a vitamin deficiency, but they're often profitable. So in these cases, these water-soluble vitamins might be acting more like additives than actual vitamins. But again, that really doesn't matter. The response is often profitable. And with that, I'll turn it back to Abby. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but I'll turn it back to Abby for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss, for walking us through these vitamins and their role in dairy cattle diets. It was very helpful to learn a little bit more about each of them and how we can make adjustments to the ration. So thank you so much. To view this webinar again, or any of our previous webinars, you can visit the archives at our website at any time. You can find that at hordes.com, and there's a webinar tab, and you'll find all of our past presentations there on a wide variety of topics. So please check it out if you're looking for some information sources on, like I said, on an array of topics. We hope that you'll make plans to attend our next webinar, which will take place on Monday, August 14th. Our presenter will be Dr. John Gazer from Rock River Laboratory, and he'll be talking about the current corn harvest season, talking about growing conditions and then preparing for harvesting corn that may have grown under variable growing conditions. So we would encourage you to check out that presentation. And then in September, we'll have Pam Rug from Michigan State University joining us to talk about maximizing milk quality and then minimizing mastitis. So mark your calendar if those topics interest you, and we hope that you will attend one or both of those webinars. Now, we had some questions that came in, so I will present those to Dr. Weiss at this time, and if you have any more, feel free to comment in the question section of the control panel, and we'll address those right now. So first question here, Dr. Weiss, it says, for operations that are kind of a hybrid situation, maybe partial confinement, partial pasture, do you need to adjust the supplement levels? For example, in their operation, cows have access to pasture sometimes, but not always and not consistently for the same time or amount of time per day.
I would, in that situation, I would just, for vitamin D, I would assume no sun and just supplement it as a confined cow. It's not worth worrying about. Vitamin A, the cost savings isn't huge, but there is a cost. I would probably cut vitamin A if it's like during the grazing season, even if they're not out there every day. You think you could safely cut vitamin A about in half. I would not remove it all. Vitamin E, again, that's a little more expensive. I would probably cut it about in half during the grazing season. When they go into total confinement or when there's essentially no pasture out there, then treat them like confinement cattle. But even if several days a week they're grazing, again, 20–30% of the diet is pasture, I think you could safely cut A and E about in half. I would not change vitamin D.
All right, very good. Do we need to use the protected vitamins for dairy cows? For example, is there any extra benefit of supplementing with protected vitamin A?
There might be. It would be what would be if it's protected. Again, vitamin A is a lot of that's destroying the room. What it would mean is we could feed less. I don't expect to be any improvements over what we're having. You just see the same results at feeding less. So you'd have to look at the economics of protection versus just basically right now we feed more and to account for those ruminal losses. For the B vitamins like niacin, that's a little, because there's so much of that's destroyed and the responses are so variable. So that one might be a little more, or that one the benefits may be greater for some of these water soluble ones. But for the fat soluble ones, the only one that would need protection is A. And again, the only benefit I think you would see is you might be able to feed, I'm kind of guessing, you might be able to reduce supplementation rates 50%. I doubt that will cover the cost of protection. The B vitamins, because again, you lose so much, those may benefit economically from protection.
Next question, any comments on vitamin D for pre-weaned or post-weaned calves?
Well, I guess calves are not my forte. I want to mention that very clearly. Bone development vitamin D is essential for bone development, and the only vitamin D deficiency, I've seen almost no clinical deficiency of any vitamin in the 40 years I did research, but I did see rickets in growing calves. If calves are housed inside, make sure they're fed enough. And I would say again that I have no reason to doubt that, I don't know the number, but I have no reason to doubt the NASEM requirements for vitamin D for calves, plus the safety factor. And then when they become heifers, still make sure they get vitamin D. I would not rely on sunlight for vitamin D. Even if these calves and heifers are outside, I would still supplement some. Because again, during bone development, in these growing animals, vitamin D is critically important. It's always important, but it's really, really important there. I can't tell you the number because I don't know, but meet and exceed NASEM requirements by, again, about 20%, and I would not rely on the sunshine.
Thank you for tackling that. Any comments on adding beta carotene to dairy cattle rations?
Yeah, beta carotene, again, some of our beta carotene is converted to retinol, which is what we want. But we find beta carotene in blood. We find beta carotene in tissues, in certain tissues. So you kind of think if it's circulating and if it's in certain tissues, it may have functions independent of vitamin A. And the conversion happens at the gut. So once beta carotene is in circulation, it's not going to be converted to retinol. And there's a fair number of studies on beta carotene, and not all. There's, again, a lot of variability, but some of the positive responses to supplemental beta carotene is reduced retained placenta, reduced mastitis, maybe reduced metritis, generally better reproduction. And again, we think some of this is not because of vitamin A, it's because of beta carotene. So beta carotene is, I don't consider it a vitamin, I consider it a feed additive. But I'd say at dose rates, and I always forget this, the standard dose, I think it's 600 milligrams, but don't hold me to that. But so I'd say in certain cases, though, that's beneficial, and especially if you look at the data, you're much more likely to get a positive response to supplemental beta carotene when you feed basal diets that we know would be poor in beta carotene. So straw-based diets with very weathered hay, these are going to have very, very low beta carotene, and so supplemental beta carotene is more likely to be positive. In grazing situations, or when you're feeding a lot of high quality silage, it's going to be less likely to be beneficial because basal beta carotene will probably be adequate. And again, I'm not sure of the dose rate I gave, so I'd have to look that up. But it's the standard recommended dose.
Okay, thank you. The next question is timely considering we are kind of in the dog days of summer here. If dry matter intake is declining due to heat stress, is there a benefit for feeding vitamin levels above that plus 20% beyond the requirement to help with heat stress relief?
And one is you do have to adjust if they're eating less. The concentration is going to go up because the recommended amounts is basically independent of milk production. So concentrations, dietary concentrations, should be increased in the summer because intake goes down. As far as specific heat stress effects, two that I'm aware of, niacin, and this has been mostly with protected niacin, has helped with heat stress, and there is a biological reason. Niacin dilates blood vessels, it allows more heat to escape from the surface. And then vitamin E also has been shown to have some benefits in heat stress, and this might be due to antioxidants. In heat stress, we might get more free radical development, and then more vitamin E is needed to that. So it definitely increased concentrations to compensate for lower intake, and consider upping vitamin A and supplementing some niacin under hot conditions.
Okay, this question refers very specifically to some of the vitamin A data that you shared, and they're wondering if that data was generated using cross-linked beadlets or retinol acetate. I don't know if that question is clear to you.
Okay, it's if it's the one on the ruminal degradation, there was two types. These again are feed grade vitamin A supplements. The two different experiments use two different sources of vitamin A. I cannot tell you which ones are which. There is a study with beef cattle fed different 5 or 6 different commercial sources of vitamin A. They fed these for quite a while, and then you measure liver vitamin A concentration. That's a very good status indicator. And even though on an IU basis, all these cows were fed the same amount of vitamin A, but the source was different, there was a huge difference in liver vitamin A concentration or liver retinol, which says there's differences in rumen degradation, maybe potency, protection. So there is differences. The commercial sources can differ. So I'd say, buy one that has some rumen protection, not in the classic sense, but some of these are the way they formulate these beadlets and other things are more stable in the rumen than others. I'd ask for, whatever source you're buying, ask if they have data on breakdown of the product, and it can be just breakdown why it's stored, but there is a substantial difference, or there was a substantial difference in the biopotency of different vitamin A sources. but I cannot tell you from that slide. I just can't remember which products were used, but they were commercially available.
Great. Is there a practical way to check on farm to ensure that cows are receiving adequate intake of vitamins?
Well, there's a way, but it's really expensive. Vitamin A and E are relatively in the plasma, are relatively easy to measure, but it's still expensive. It takes some expensive instruments. And plasma vitamin E is related to response. So we have some cutoff values. If it's below a certain amount, we'd say, okay, these cows could benefit from more vitamin E. Vitamin A in plasma, even though you can measure it, may not mean much because the liver stores it a lot. You can feed a diet void of vitamin A for a long time, blood levels hardly change, but the liver values are dropping. So you could do a liver biopsy and measure retinol, and that will be a good status indicator. It's not very practical, and it's very expensive. For the water solubles, these are extraordinarily difficult to measure. And if they're extraordinarily difficult to measure, it means they're also extraordinarily expensive to measure. So I'd say for the B vitamins, there's really not a practical or a realistic way to measure status, or whether, if you're feeding them to guarantee it's in there. They're just not a good measurement.
What is your opinion or recommendation, or what is better, buying vitamins, a mixture of vitamins and minerals, or separately purchasing particular minerals or vitamins and then mixing it at the farm level?
We are talking about minute quantities. We say 100,000, 200,000 units of vitamin A. That's not even a milligram. These are very, very small amounts. On farm mixing, you cannot mix them accurately enough. I would definitely buy premixes with minerals and vitamins. Be aware that if there's inorganic trace minerals in there, be aware of a breakdown and keep inventory turned over. But because of the amounts are so small, I think you just cannot be accurate enough on farm. You should buy a premix and then mix that into the TMR. And I guess one last thing, again, on these vitamins, you're not using a lot, and they do decay. And on-farm storage isn't ideal. It gets hot, it gets humid, may be exposed to sun, may get moist. So degradation in the bag is likely higher than what we would see from a feed mill. So you might be buying these vitamins, but then by the time you actually get to using that whole bag up, potency has dropped a lot. So you bought expensive vitamins and lost a lot of them. So I'd recommend buying a premix from a mill.
That makes a lot of sense. A comment and a question here: sprouted grains have higher levels of vitamins. Would that be a good way to supplement a diet to include some vitamin A, D, or E?
It's the fatty feeds like oil seeds have a lot of vitamin E. They do not have any vitamin A. Plants don't make vitamin A. They probably don't have a lot of beta carotene, but I don't know. Vitamin D, most feeds are essentially void of vitamin D. There's some maybe in a sun-cured hay, there's some, but feeds are very low in vitamin D. So these oil seeds, whether I consider them mostly vitamin E. I don't think they're major sources of A or D. In a plant or in a seed, the vitamin E is plain tocopherol. When you buy supplemental vitamin E, it's tocopherol, usually tocopherol acetate. And that acetate protects from oxidation, protects breakdown. So tocopherol, which is seen in expellers, it might have a high concentration, but it's also going to break down pretty quickly. So if you got whole beans and expel them daily or pretty frequency, they're going to have some vitamin E. But again, if you make a batch for the week, by the end of the week, there's not going to be much vitamin E left in those seeds. So again, it's risk reward. I would just say, okay, if I'm feeding expellers, I might be getting a little bit extra vitamin E. It might have a benefit, but I probably would not make big adjustments to supplementation rates.
Right, and we had a couple questions just revolving around do we need to supplement with vitamins? So I'm going to share one example here, and this will be our final question. This person says they feed 100% grass diet plus some barley, and barley added, I guess, as a supplement. They have good fat and protein production and good milk production, wondering if they need to supplement some vitamins or what they should be supplementing.
If by grass they mean pasture, then likely they do not need vitamin E, supplemental vitamin E. The cows still need vitamin E, but the diet probably has enough. The diet probably has enough beta carotene, but again, for risk reward, I'd feed a little supplemental A. D, if they're outside all day, probably don't need supplemental D, but again, is it worth the risk? They probably don't need it, but a little bit probably is just insurance. On the water soluble ones, that's kind of independent. Like say Biotin and foot health. There's a big study in Australia with grazing cattle. Supplemental biotin improved the hoof health of these grazing cattle. Choline and so on. These are independent of the basal, or mostly independent of the basal diet. So you still might get benefits from supplemental B vitamins and choline, but for the fat soluble ones, you likely don't need supplementation. If you want a little insurance, I'd feed probably a little supplemental A and D, but I would not supplement vitamin E in that situation. As long as they're on fresh pasture, when they go in, when the growing season is over, then you need to start supplementing.
Thank you very much for answering that question. And just in general, thank you so much, Dr. Weiss, for joining us for this webinar. We're really glad that you took so much time and care to put together this presentation and then share it with our audience. Just want to remind everybody out there that our webinars always take place the second Monday of the month at noon Central Time. So please check us out for a future webinar. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University for presenting for us today and then answering all the great questions that followed. I want to thank my teammate Patty for her work on the production side of the show. And then once again, thank you to everyone out in the audience for your time and attention today. We are really glad that you could join us for this session of the Hordes Dairyman monthly webinars. Until next time, goodbye from all of us here at Hordes Dairyman.